Gamers, let me ask you a question. Are you hardcore or are you casual? If you're anything like me, you blanch at both of these labels. Something like this, right? Hardcore gamers try too hard. Casuals don't try hard enough. I, on the other hand, try just the right amount. And I get it, because I feel that way too. Do you remember the 90s? I mean, gaming in the 90s. Betraying my age here, but one of my fondest memories of the 90s was gathering around the TV with my buddies and beating the crap out of each other in Mario Kart 64. I was good at it, better than my friends. At Mario Kart, at GoldenEye, at Smash Brothers, and at pretty much any other game we played. Now, whether or not you're a 90s kid, my guess is, if you're watching this video, that you have a story just like this. There was some small moment time ago where you dumpstered your friends and it was glorious. You realized that you were a gamer, and a pretty good one. It started becoming part of your identity. Then at some point, you joined a guild, enrolled in a tournament, or turned on a stream. You took a step out of your comfort zone into a bigger world and had to face up to the brutal reality that when you beat your friends, you were just a big fish in a small pond, and there's always a bigger fish. Okay, so we're not the biggest fish or the most hardcore gamer. But are we casuals? I know at least one game dev who would say no. I don't know who they are as they choose to remain anonymous, but the Ask a Game Dev blog is a fantastic resource to help gamers understand game devs and how they make games. One of my favorite topics on the blog covers the 80-25 principle of gaming communities, where Ask a Game Dev states that on average, out of all the people who play your game, only about 5% will ever take to social media to say what they think. 20% will go to social media to read what others think, and a whopping 80% will never say or read anything about your game outside the game itself. Which, if you're watching this video, automatically excludes you from the casual 80%. So, here we are. Not quite a casual, not yet a hardcore. Welcome, gamers, to the middle class of MMO enjoyers. And you know what? Maybe it's a good thing. Moderation is a virtue, after all. Even Buddha, when seeking enlightenment, couldn't find it at the extremes, but rather in the middle. But sometimes I wonder, have MMOs forgotten about us? For casual players, modern MMOs do a great job of laying out a delightful, low-friction, golden path of content. And for hardcores, most of those same games are eager to pile on thick and overlapping layers of grinds, challenge, and progression. But what about the space between? I was playing Destiny 2 recently, and it really got me thinking about this. Now, from what I can tell, there are generally two ways you can play Destiny. First is as a casual. You play new expansions, new systems, new stories, and see it all at once. For a little extra credit, you can slip in before the big launches to binge the prior year's seasonal stuff, which can be pretty good too. The other way is as a hardcore. You grind exotics, seals, weapons, armor, seasonal tracks, and of course your light level. You'll tackle tough challenges along the way, but that's not what you're logging in for. You're logging in for the grind. Despite this dreary characterization, though, there is something pretty cool that you can get out of hardcore Destiny that's not really on the table for casuals. Human contact. Because of its gentle difficulty and automatic matchmaking, the casual Destiny experience kind of turns other people into bots. Interacting with them is optional and usually difficult. They seem to give an impression of a community that I'm not really sure is there. And that's always bothered me. Connectivity was supposed to be the one thing that made MMOs MMOs, right? Why go to all this trouble to connect all these people in an online world and just turn it into a backdrop for a single player game? I think back to World of Warcraft and its class design. From summons to portals to lockpicking to the almighty tank and healer roles. They were built from the ground up with the idea that you, as a solo player, are incomplete. I remember on my first day with my first character, taking on and dying at the feet of the legendary foe known only as Hogger. After failing, I camped out by the roadside and started messaging people. Got a response, and with help was able to take down the foul beast. We celebrated, of course, and turned in our quest, and then found ourselves both on the road west to the next adventure. And we elected to stay together, because we were stronger together, and we became friends, because the game world encouraged us at every turn to not go at it alone. Not by offering achievements or challenge modes or hardcore loot, but rather by putting mundane, everyday content in the world that needed cooperation in the absence of sharding and matchmaking and mega server architecture. The brilliance of World of Warcraft wasn't in its leveling system or in its loot progression, but in the fact that levels and loot told the story of a player's experience. And that story was told to a captive realm of no more than a few thousand players who saw, griefed, and buffed each other day in and day out. I think, in hindsight, that vanilla World of Warcraft might have been some kind of MMO middle-class paradise. It wasn't particularly hard, but it was vast, and offered thousands of chances for your character, your skill, and your friends to matter. In a pre-social media era, and without Golden Path story content that held your hand, it kind of defied both hardcore metagamers and backseat casual gamers alike. What was left was a heaping portion of MMO middle-class content. Going back to our Destiny example, though, for a minute. We've talked a bit about the casual experience, and now I want to say a bit more about the hardcore, which, over time, I found isn't really for me. Simply put, Destiny's guns are slot machines. Every time you pull one, you're getting one combination out of about 500,000. A smart Destiny player is probably targeting no more than a handful of these random rolls of the dice, so they'll be grinding out the same content hundreds or thousands of times before landing their jackpot. Destiny occupies these players with all kinds of challenges and overlapping progression paths that'll keep them busy and in need of teammates, which leads to one thing about hardcore Destiny that I actually really appreciate. It's not so lonely. So here's the question. What does Destiny have to offer for us MMO middle-classers? No, I'm really asking. What is there? Because I've looked in dungeons and raids and the legendary campaign and exotic quests and all this content that hardcore Destiny players love to trot out as examples of good experiences that don't ask you to grind. My experience with this content is that it can go one of two ways. First, if you've got a pack of friends willing to roll into the experience with you, all fresh for the first time, you can have that awesome MMO experience. It'll push you to tweak your loadouts, play better, put on your puzzle solving hats, and when everything lines up, it's just beautiful. If you don't have a pack of friends, however, you'll have to meet some. And this is where Destiny has always fallen flat for me. Remember what I was saying earlier about Hogger? About how it was day one content that pushed you out of your solo bubble? And about how it positioned players perfectly to encourage groups who came together to stay together? Well, one important thing I might have left out. All that only worked because WoW put you into a situation where it was possible to bump into other players at the same point in their journey within the game world. Destiny just doesn't do that. If I ask myself why, it's probably got something to do with the game's console origins. But whatever the reason, the grim reality is you can't meet Destiny players by playing Destiny. It's just not built that way. If you're okay with jumping into Discords and streamer chats and bumping shoulders with hardcore veteran grinders, then you're good. You're a budding hardcore. There's definitely something there for you. If not, well, you'll probably find yourself in the place I am with Destiny in 2022, still waiting for it to grow out of its beautiful shell. But just in case my Destiny example sailed over your head a little bit, let me hit you with one more. I'm gonna bring in Guild Wars 2, a game that, a decade ago, marketed itself as a solution to the MMO genre. The problem? Boring combat, boring storytelling, and boring grind. And to their credit, I think they mostly pulled it off. What came out of it was an impressive MMO that felt great, looked great, and now has a well-earned reputation as an awesome casual game. It defends its reputation with constant, high-quality story releases that expand the world and in delivering really cool open-world MMO experiences with an event system that feels a million miles downstream from questing in the Barrens. For you hardcore gamers, there are plenty of optional grinds to pound out, but overall, Guild Wars 2 has always felt like it comfortably sat on the casual side of the MMO spectrum. To me, it could have been an MMO middle class tour de force, but for a couple things. First, combat is tuned to rarely challenge the player. This is especially egregious in the launch content, which all free-to-play players start with, and which players have proven can be beaten without ever activating a skill. Without that simple bit of friction, players don't really have incentive to learn their class, or figure out a build, or to play nice with others. Something, by the way, that Guild Wars 2 seems to love to brag about. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some hotspots of challenge in this game, but to me, they're the exception that proves the rule. Second thing, Guild Wars 2 abandoned the holy trinity of MMO class design. Now, this isn't bad in itself, but what replaced it is a bit muddy. Every class in Guild Wars 2 does damage, buffs players, and heals themselves. And as a result, everyone is a solo damage dealer. And for the vast majority of the game, you won't ever need to look for a tank or wait for a healer or indeed even talk to anyone. Because these classes don't depend on each other, players just don't need each other. And to me, as a bit of an old head, that's just a bit of a bummer. Okay, so let's recap. We've talked about casual gamers who tend to live or die on golden paths of easy content. We've talked about hardcore gamers for whom no grind is too long and no upgrade too minor. And we've talked about the space between, the mids, the MMO middle class, and their desire for content that lands somewhere between trivial and unreasonable. My observation over 20 years of playing these games is that as time wears on, this MMO middle class is slowly vanishing. I've given you my impression of Guild Wars 2 and Destiny 2, not because this is a Destiny 2 or Guild Wars 2 problem, but rather because they've had expansions this year and are top of mind. Maybe you've looked around and seen this too, or maybe not. To be honest, this whole MMO middle class idea isn't something I've studied or anything. It's just a strong vibe I've been living in for the past few years as I've played these games and spent time in their communities. If you have too, and can connect with anything I'm saying here, then would you do me a favor and let me know? But wait, we're not quite done yet. Because I don't want to paint the people that make these games as some kind of villain or unwitting antagonist. They're not. Instead, I believe MMOs have come to be the way they are for generally good reasons, after being hashed out by pretty smart people who are trying to deal with really hard problems. One of these problems is pretty easy to understand on the surface. Making games is incredibly expensive. It's gone from being this thing a handful of dudes in their parents' garage could bang out in a summer to being the largest entertainment industry in the world, and the projects have scaled up to meet that demand. So, what do you do if you're going to invest a chunk of $1 billion in making a video game? Well, you'll want a lot of people to play it. More importantly, you'll want a lot of people to keep playing it, to the point where those people can justify to themselves opening their wallets to your cash shop. So, you'll create a golden content path that ensures a smooth experience. Along that path, hopefully you'll thrill them, and in doing so, introduce them to the people, places, and systems of your world that will hook them in. And you'll make sure that it's all done with as little friction as possible to ensure that no one gets left behind on their way to where you want them to go. So, you'll remove an ability from a tricky early story boss. You'll clear the starter zones of any elite mobs for the same reasons. And then you'll nerf the HP of open world mobs by 30% when your metrics tell you that 71% of players you fail to retain after 2 weeks bounce after dying 5 times in the open world. You'll reason to yourself that this is okay, because you want to funnel them to the new content anyway. And when they get there and run into a brick wall of difficulty because they haven't been challenged, you'll address the former rather than the latter. And if you're not careful, what you'll have done is create a game that, in trying to please everybody, pleases nobody. Because difficulty excludes people. And with the project costs we're seeing, that just isn't acceptable. I saw a great interview with Chris Wilson the other day. He's the CEO of Grinding Gear Games, a one-game studio made up of dudes who couldn't get enough Diablo, so they made their own and called it Path of Exile. In the interview, Chris explained how they dealt with this very problem. Their tactic was to design PoE around a target user count of about 10,000 users, and that would be enough to comfortably sustain a dev team of 15 to 20 people. This empowered them to design a game that wasn't for everyone, and it seems to have worked. This sorta suggests that a way out of the lowest common denominator golden path drudgery could lie in moderation. Don't try to be the biggest. Don't try to do everything. Be okay with making something that isn't for everyone. One of the ways Chris's team pulled this off was by creating town spaces that felt full even when the game wasn't, by limiting them to serve a max of 24 people. And when I heard that, I went from thinking I'd heard a solution to a problem to thinking that I may have just heard the origin of another. What makes an MMO an MMO? You don't have to be an MMO to have an incredible world, just look at Elder Scrolls. Same with amazing boss fights, looking at any Souls game. And of course, you don't need to be an MMO to have great PvP, just look at League of Legends. So what is it then that truly distinguishes an MMO? In my mind, it's the human contact. It's the guy who enchanted your robe. It's the tank that got you through the dungeon. And as time goes on, it's these very people that have been slowly getting designed out of the MMOs that they used to breathe life into. In a strange twist of fate, the march of MMO technology, rather than enabling us to connect like never before, seems to have instead enabled us to disconnect like never before. And somehow, along the way, we all made the assumption that the main thing we all want is to be spared from human interaction. Nobody said this better than J. Allen Brack when responding to the outcry for classic servers for World of Warcraft. He rebutted this request simply by explaining that pressing a button to go to a dungeon was way better than looking for a dungeon group yourself. Players looking for dungeons to him were problems to be solved, and Dungeon Finder had solved it already. To anyone who wanted otherwise, Brack assured them, well, you know, you think you do, but you don't. And oh, how he turned out to be wrong. I think to understand why, that we need to look at who was in the audience at BlizzCon that day. If you show up at a convention, what's your engagement level? Are you part of the quiet majority of casual gamers, or are you part of a loud minority that's anything but? When Brack addressed his response to the crowd at BlizzCon, I don't think he was only speaking to that crowd, but also to that quiet majority. The thing that makes that quiet majority so damned interesting is that as a gamer, we never hear from them. They play the same games as us, but they're not in our guilds. They're not aware of what's going on Twitch, and they certainly pay Reddit no mind. To you and me, they are invisible. And because of that, it's easy to forget that they're even there. But they are. And in fact, they outnumber us. Game devs like Brack know this all too well because they have the data. They can see what players are doing, and that data tells devs like him that technology like Dungeon Finder represents the greater good for their community, visible and invisible. The fact that Brack ended up being wrong and that there were actually a large and sustainable interest in exactly what those vocal players thought they wanted shows us how data can't tell us everything. It also shows us why games like Destiny 2, Guild Wars 2, Path of Exile, and so many others are designed, in most cases, to prevent the need for inter-player communication. And lastly, it shows us exactly why the single quality that MMOs possess that distinguish them from all other video games, talking to people, has gone from being something everyone in an MMO had to do to being something that only hardcore players must do. So, if you like talking to people, but don't feel at home among the hardcore scene, you might find yourself in the same spot that I'm in, caught between the casuals and the hardcore, in an MMO middle class that seems to be vanishing right before our very eyes.